Episode 4 was recorded before the tragic murder of George Floyd. From myself and Souphiane, we want to take the opportunity to say rest in peace to George Floyd, and our hearts go out to his family. Black Lives Matter. All right, what's going on, Souph? How you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, man. I'm good. Weather's actually not too bad in the UK at the moment, which is it's a nice, pleasant change. Obviously, you can't really go outside much, but hey.
Yeah, that's typical. The couple of weeks you get nice weather, you're kind of confined to like what you can do and stuff. But yeah, we can go outside. The weather's good, but like a lot of the places, like the recreational places, are closed still. So you're limited on where you can and can't go. So the beaches and stuff are closed. So I mean, I guess that's part of the issue with COVID, right? The opening up process, as they start to unveil like the next steps to getting society back up and running, is like, how do you mitigate the risks of reopening these public places?
Yeah, it's definitely decisions that I don't envy the government in respective countries, trying to make sure, and states obviously as well, trying to make sure that they do it in a way that doesn't put the public at large at risk. So yeah, it's not an easy decision to make. I understand obviously why these precautions are put in place in terms of stopping people gathering en masse, but yeah, getting back up to speed, it's difficult right now to see what that actually looks like.
Yeah, and I guess it speaks to a larger point. If these measures are unveiled to get things back up and running, public transport, public places, etc., it doesn't mitigate the risk of the virus, right? We covered it before, but the reality is the virus is still a thing that will exist in the world. And the idea of going back to normal society just means that the risk is still there. And myself, for one, I don't feel any safer because the government has said it's okay to go outside. I'm at a point myself where I am starting to slowly, incrementally get my life back to normal. And I feel okay with that. I feel like the numbers out here in California would sort of warrant those steps. But then I understand people who, live with elderly relatives or people with immunocompromised, why they wouldn't want to do that. But I guess it speaks to a more broad point of how the government has dealt with it. And I know something we've been thinking a lot about is how people's rights are being encroached upon as a response to COVID. Do you think encroaching on people's rights can be justified by public health concerns?
I think some of what the government and, what's been in the news stories and measures they're looking to implement, and some of them I would appreciate that to some people might appear a bit draconian. We seem to be repeating, like history seems to repeat itself. There's a massive crisis. The government takes steps to mitigate risk by essentially increasing their executive power. They don't really put any sort of time constraints on when those powers are going to be sort of revoked. Then the issue resolves itself, but then now the government has this newfound power and they sometimes use it. When I say the government, they distribute that power to its the authorities that sit under it, i.e. the police or local authorities or councils, local government bodies. And I mean, we see it in the UK, stop and search powers after 9/11, that, they were able to stop individuals in the street based on that horrific event that happened, sort of open the door for them to increase their power essentially over the public. If past is prologue, I do wonder some of these, the legislation that the government is looking to implement in order to sort of, flatten the curve or mitigate the damage that this virus does. I do wonder what's going to happen after that. Like, what's the situation going to look like? How are they going to abuse those powers?
In response to situations that have had damaging effects on society, like, the example of terrorism is great, right? Measures were introduced on the back of those, right? And I think for the general population, they're more concerned about their immediate safety than a civil liberty, which may seem like something that's easier to compromise on, right? I know, for example, going through the airport, taking your shoes off, of course it inconveniences people, but in the aftermath of for example, 9/11, people can say, well, it's only 2 seconds to take your shoes off. I don't mind doing that because it's for the public good. When something is fresh in the mind, like a terrorist attack, it's easy for those things to. And given the hysteria around COVID-19, I think it's a similar circumstance, right? There's a mass hysteria. People are, rightfully scared and concerned for safety. But, like, for example, over here, they're looking at you implementing contact tracing. So it's a way of tracking who you've been in contact with. So if you're diagnosed with COVID, they can use cell phone data to track who you've been in contact with to kind of trace back or trace forward the pathway of the virus. Now, when you're trying to flatten the curve, etc., you could see why this is an important measure. But the idea of the government having access to your data is something that, when this risk is no longer imminent, are we still going to be sacrificing that power? And I think that's something that a lot of people are just not thinking about. It's definitely concerning to me.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, I don't want to fearmonger and sort of make it sound like we're headed to this sort of dystopian, like 1984 like future. But it's, the concerns that I have, and I'm sure it's shared by many other people. If you're going to put these measures in place, the majority of the public aren't criminals. The majority of the public are, law-abiding citizens, and what they really want from government and local authority is just transparency, basically. And it's like, and just an explanation as to why these things are happening and for how long they're going to be happening. And at work, you get asked to put a business proposal together or something. You'll be asked to sort of measure the impact or, provide data on why you think it's a good idea. And then whilst you're in the project, you have to submit data to say that I implemented this change and it resulted in this impact. So I guess this is what people want. Like, if you're going to implement some legislation in order to combat something, I think people just want the data to support it and just an understanding of how long that's going to be and what that's going to look like. I think that's really what it comes down to. And I think people aren't necessarily getting that. We're seeing that cases are going down, but they're still suggesting, ramping things up in terms of, facial recognition when you're leaving your house to make sure that you are abiding by, the government guidelines that, to stay indoors. And the police aren't necessarily being forthcoming with how they're using that information. So I think that's the concern for people. It's, are these authorities being transparent of how they're using their powers and the data they're collecting on us? Yeah,
but I think, given some of the, if you look globally, some of the governments have implemented these measures and they have been successful, kind of justifies almost like our own governments using it, right? So like, I think South Korea was held up as the beacon of dealing with COVID, right? They were seen as the country that dealt with it best. They got their numbers down quickly. They contained the virus quickly. And, it was a big pat on the back of South Korea. And, this is a society or a country that is very technologically advanced, and the use of smartphone apps was sort of central to them being able to trace the root of the virus in the country. So it's hard for people to say like, oh, the government can't do this or shouldn't do this when it is proven to work, right? That's the sort of evidence that they base these decisions on, right? It's worked in X, so we should implement it in Y. But yeah, so do you think these sorts of situations, with a public health crisis, they warrant the erosion of civil liberties? Do you foresee a situation where like this can be justified?
It's kind of just the situation we're in, isn't it? It's somewhere along the line, we made the decision to allow a central body to dictate to us, how we should behave. More and more, year by year, decade by decade, we hand over more right to the government in terms of how they sort of instruct us. In this instance, they're organizing people and, set some guidelines to be like, this is how you need to behave in order to avert this crisis. We allow them to decide what they teach in schools and even how we should be raising kids. And there's more and more responsibility that we quite willingly hand over to the government and expect them to sort of tell us how we need to behave. We like to talk about sort of social rights and sovereignty that we all have as individuals. The way the system's set up is that we allow the government to just put forward these guidelines and we trust them to make the correct decisions and we follow them. Am I happy with, erosion of rights? I'm not happy with, I think everyone should have their own, we as a society, I should say, have kind of agreed that individuals should have a degree of sovereignty and a degree of human rights, and the government encroaching on that is kind of seen as a bad thing. But I don't know if it's going to combat, we've clearly showed that ourselves, we're quite bad at sort of organizing ourselves and even following the guidelines that they've suggested. So we're not really in a state to provide a better solution. I mean, in a nutshell, I'm just saying that we've been pampered basically, and then we kind of pick and choose sometimes when we want our human rights and when we don't. We're like, yeah, I'm kind of happy with you controlling all the industry and travel and all this stuff. Oh, but this stuff, I'd rather I took a hand over. It's kind of, if you want, if you kind of need to, you can't have your cake and eat it. At the end of the day, we've entrusted the government to look after our best interests, and we have a system, a democratic system that's been in place in order to maintain that. And I think people at the moment, when it doesn't necessarily suit their interests, they like to sort of wave that flag of, oh, you're encroaching on my human rights. I guess is the basis of what I'm trying to get at.
Right. Yeah, we've been heading towards more of a nanny state for a long time in the UK, and I guess this is sort of a byproduct of that. I mean, we've grown up in a country that surveillance is rife, right? CCTV cameras are everywhere, and I know that Americans that have gone to England have all come back and say, like, oh, there's so many cameras everywhere, there's so many cameras. And it's funny because I do notice the difference in behavior patterns over here with the absence of the cameras, for example, on the roads, right? Like as a motorist in the UK, we've got a very, very measured, very safe way of driving, right? Whereas and I think that's because of the abundance of cameras and the risk of getting caught for speeding and, general surveillance. In the US, I mean, I live in California, and I could honestly say the driving here scares the shit out of me. The way people drive, man, honestly, generally, I'll be going 70 in a 65, and I'll have people in my rearview mirror getting pissed off at me for not going faster. And I'm like, wow, these people are just, they don't give a shit, right? And I do wonder if that's because there is not that surveillance to sort of instill that fear of being caught for breaking the law. And it's a catch-22, because on the one hand, like, I obviously value having safer roads and not being put at risk of getting murked on the roads by someone going 95 miles an hour. And I sort of miss that adherence to traffic laws. But then on the other hand, I'm like, well, yeah, cameras everywhere is bad because of X and because of Y. License number plate recognition is creepy because they can see where you've been at all times, right? I think it's about striking that balance, and I think you're right, man. It's like we have to find a way that the government is transparent about what they're doing, but then also put in reasonable limits on the powers that they've gained under whatever circumstance. So like if they introduce something now off the back of COVID, maybe ensure that it is only applied for the next year, right?
I think that would be a good measure. And to talk about what you said about earlier in terms of the social pressure, that there is in terms of, I mean, you spoke specifically about surveillance, but a long time ago, that used to be the community would put pressure on individuals in order to behave a certain way. It would be that don't be a shithead in the community, because that's a bad thing. We're all here together. We're all trying to work together for the greater good. And then over time, communities got bigger. There was more and more communities, and we sort of handed over that community responsibility and structure to the government. So the government is now the community, and they make the decisions on how we need to implement that social pressure, as we kind of said, on the individuals. They've chosen, and they don't necessarily, because it's such a big machine, they're not as sensitive necessarily to the smaller pockets in society that might exist in a country or that might exist in a particular area.
That's a really good point, because I think the idea of keeping the community members in check is something that we've seen erode over time, certainly in the UK, and for me personally, I think that's a result, obviously, one, of increase in population size, but two, I think due to multiculturalism in some ways, right? As countries become more diverse, that sort of community cohesion, I think, does erode, and I think people are less able to relate to their neighbors, and there's a less shared homogenous cultural norm, right? And it's something I'd never really, full disclosure, right? For both of us, we're both first gen, Brits essentially, right? We're, I guess, ethnically non-British, whatever that means. And so growing up, I always championed multiculturalism in the UK and thought it was great. And for a lot of ways it is, what it's brought to the country culturally. But obviously, when I was living abroad, when I lived in South Korea, and it's a country that's really homogenous, and there's not the diversity, the racial diversity, the cultural diversity that we have back home in the UK, I really started to notice some of the benefits of like a homogenous culture, and it was just a sense of there's a shared norm, right? There's a shared norm that everyone understands, everyone gets, and it's behaviors that affect the community negatively are sort of ostracized and highlighted because everyone sort of is playing from the same rule book to an extent. And it's tricky because I'm not sitting here trying to say kick all immigrants out of England, obviously. See you later, mum. Bye, mum.
Yeah, bye,
Yeah,
mum. Bye,
yeah,
dad. Bye, dad.
but I do think is something that as we increase and head in that direction increasingly, uh, those sorts of issues are highlighted. And yeah, I mean, something that kind of comes up a lot with um, this diversity, like racial diversity that I see in the US, is like this exercise of power from a dominant race to a non-dominant race in society, right? So like, obviously historically white Americans have sort of, controlled institutions in this country. And, I think it's fair to say that African Americans have found themselves at the bottom of the social totem pole in a lot of ways. And like that dynamic, you still see it playing out all the time here. The racial divide is really apparent a lot of the time. And this is in a state that prides itself on being progressive, prides itself on being liberal. It doesn't have some of like the racial history that they have in the South. And it's still apparent here. So obviously something that has really been in the news a lot recently is the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, who was a young man in Georgia, in the state of Georgia, who was like killed by two civilians essentially. And it's really obviously brought back up a lot of the issues, the racial tensions in this country, where like specifically black men are being killed and the perpetrators of those crimes are not being dealt with in what appears to be a just way. So I know you've obviously looked into the case of like, what have you gleaned from what you've read about it?
I mean, first of all, I want to say that it's a absolutely sort of tragic case from what it looks from the outset. It's just a regular dude going out for a jog, and he was sort of apprehended by these two men. And I mean, yeah, it's absolutely tragic. It's tragic for the family of the victim. I can't imagine sort of what they're sort of going through. Loss of a child, even like that, is just it must be hard for them. When I'm watching it, there's a lot of like you said, racial tension. As Brits looking at the news in the US, it kind of seems as like par for the course. Like it's just there's a lot of this sort of stuff going on where ethnic minorities are being mistreated by other members of the public or even the police, absolutely brutalized. Over here in the UK, it's a completely different story. Like, of course, that stuff happens in terms of, police, stopping. There's a lot of sort of tension with certain communities, like the Muslim community, for example, where they feel that they're stereotyped or typecasted into, being a terrorist or whatever, being stopped by police and being questioned. That stuff does happen. I don't want to, paint England to be this lovely island full of, where everyone holds hands and in unison and sings O Britannia. But for me, what I'm trying to wrap my head around, we talked about community and, and I think that sense of community is a lot more apparent in the US in terms of, you might live in a neighborhood and everyone, particularly in some states, I'd imagine the sort of community aspect is a lot more prevalent in an area like Georgia than it is in California, let's say, for example. And these two individuals, took it upon themselves to, it looked like to make a citizen's arrest, and then felt that they had the right to take another man's life. And I think that's for me, that's the hard. I think I try to remove all the context out of it. Like I remove all the sort of the race and forget about all that. It's that two men felt empowered to just hunt this guy down in a car. It looked like a hunting video.
Yeah.
It looked like it was like a hunt. Like they were driving a large car. Both had guns, like hunting this guy down who was unarmed. He wasn't. He only became aggressive when he was provoked and when he was attacked. At least from the video. And that's the worst of humanity. Like to be able to do that to another individual. That's for me the most difficult thing to even comprehend the way that whole situation went down. That's just my take on it. But
a couple of really interesting things that you kind of brought up there. So the idea of community in a place like Georgia, where the idea of community is so closely built around the idea of race, right? It's a place that obviously has a long history of segregation. I think the idea of community there exists in a very linear fashion. If you are this, you live in this neighborhood and you look like this. And if you are that, you live in that neighborhood. And there's a real sense of like otherness in this country that don't particularly feel in the UK. So one of the observations I made when I first moved out here is how quick people are to like advocate and advertise what they are and what they believe in. And the best example of it is like bumper stickers on cars, right? No one has bumper stickers in England, right? They might have a Man United badge on their bumper, right? And that'll be about it.
Friends in the UK can talk to, they can know each other for years and years, and they won't even know the most, intimate details between each other. They could be friends for entirety, but they won't know. I think in England, you're right. I think people are less forthcoming with that sort of information. Or that's definitely the case.
I think it's less. I think it's less central to their identity. And, you know, out here you'll see, I mean, just reading off some of the ones I've seen that spring to mind, it will be proud parent of an 8th grade honor student. It's like, okay, you want everyone to know and be proud of your kid, but then the need to put that on your car and let people know. I've seen people with anti-abortion bumper stickers, right? That's a view that you want to let people, whatever side of the fence you're on about the abortion debate, the fact that you have to let people know this is what you believe in, it's mind-blowing to me. You know, I'm Italian American or whatever it is. It's a culture that really focuses on the identity, and that sort of polarizing, identity-driven culture is ultimately feeding into this sort of like fear of the other, and particularly like fear of the Black community because of the racial context of this killing. And obviously, given the history and given the situation in this country, is something that they do need to talk about. But more to the point, like you said, the cost of life, value on human life here is not. It blows my mind that for a developed first world country, the value of life can be taken so quickly. The abundance of weapons, and that has to play a part of it, right? The fact is that you know that at any moment, especially in more gun-friendly states where you can be shot, and like their willingness to go to the point of killing somebody who is unarmed. It's just, if your issue is the fact that they shot somebody, right, then you have to talk about gun crime. If you think that their issue, if the issue is that they felt emboldened to kill somebody, talk about the stand your ground rules in Georgia, right, which allows people to, you know, essentially protect themselves if they feel that they're being attacked. So there's so many issues that feed into this killing being able to happen. And then when you throw the divisive culture, divided society, you know, it's a recipe for disaster, and we're going to keep seeing these things happen until those issues are addressed.
No, I couldn't agree more, man. It's just, I mean, obviously, you know, living here, so you see the news stories, and it's quite prevalent here, but it's obviously not as close to home. And for me, and it just seems so alien. Like, it seems like such an alien concept that you're willing to trust hundreds of thousands and millions of people with very dangerous weapons. And obviously, I don't want to get into the whole gun debate because it's a, you know, highly contested subject. But you're right. It's just, what do you expect? No, you give people, you know, this sense of empowerment, and you give people weapons, sprinkle on a bit of racial tension, and then you're all scratching your heads like, oh, why are people dying? Oh, this is really sad. Like, it's just, for me, it's so formulaic to me. It seems like and obviously sitting from here, the problems are very easily recognizable as to why these things keep on happening. But for whatever reason, steps aren't necessarily being taken in order to prevent them. The fact that, you know, 2 individuals felt it was necessary to hunt down somebody and kill them, to me, it's just baffling. It's upsetting as well.
Yeah, and we're not under any illusions here, right? Banning guns is not going to stop racial attacks or racially motivated or incidents that have a racial undertone to them, right? That's not what we're saying. But the reality is, if these people don't have the resources to fucking shoot somebody at point blank range, then people are not going to die like this. To sit down here and talk about the sources and causes of racism is just obviously beyond the scope of this podcast for now. The fixation on taking life, like I said, I'm not going to sit here and rag on America because I might get deported, but you know, in some ways it's an amazing country, but in other ways, man, you get a sense of like they're so far behind society wise. It scares me sometimes, man.
How many cases? I mean, we can Google it now. Like, how many cases have there been of like this? Eric Gardner, yeah, like cases like that, or the Trayvon Martin. The list goes on and on of like instances like this. And then obviously everyone's upset at the time, and everyone rallies and, you know, talks about, you know, steps that need to be taken to avoid situations like this. But then it kind of just reverts back to whatever it was before, and that momentum seems to die for whatever reason. And
we're not sitting here, you know. I'm not accusing these men of anything, right? The question over whether or not they killed Ahmaud Arbery is not for debate. We've seen video of it. They obviously killed this man. The thing that is so shocking about it was the fact that the local authorities didn't prosecute these men, right? And so it was deemed that the killing was lawful and justified. So it's 2 issues. It's one, the fact that they feel emboldened, you know, and they have the resources to kill somebody. But then on the other hand, that there are states that have these like stand your ground laws, which essentially are giving people a license to take a life without facing the repercussions that they might need to. And now, of course, there's instances where you're forced to protect your home, and, you know, those cases can't be overlooked because they do matter when people are trying to protect their property and their family. But, you know, I think it's given a lot of people free reign to kill people. And in this case, it's sort of intersected with this really prevalent racial history in the US. So for us, you know, speaking for both of us, now that we do a podcast, I refer to everything as us. But, you know, we obviously both have a legal education, and I think we do have a tendency to see things in quite from a legal perspective, right? So, you know, with this incident that we're talking about, I can foresee a situation where these men are acquitted because the law is the law. And if the people whose job it is to seek justice determine that, okay, based on the circumstances, based on the situation, this was a lawful killing, then that is the law. But it doesn't detract from the bigger issues at play here. And I think sometimes it's hard to talk about these issues in a black and white legal sense when there is so much emotive conversation around it. Yeah, so I mean, the reality is, even though these men have now been charged with killing this man, there's no guarantees that they're going to go through the legal system and be convicted, right? And we've seen it multiple times in situations where police officers and civilians have killed people, you know, most notably the Trayvon Martin case with George Zimmerman. Some of these states have a stand your ground law, which essentially means that you're permitted to use lethal force against a threat or a perceived threat. And even to the point that if you feel, you know, if it's easier for you to retreat or if retreat is possible, you can still enact the stand your ground defense. So if these men have lawyers that can prove this or show that their clients were in fear of their life, they could walk.
First of all, I agree with at least having something in place entrenched in law that allows individuals to, when they feel threatened, they can take preventative measures in order to try and evade, or if they have the capability to defend themselves. 100%, I agree with that. What I don't agree with what you just said there is, because what you said was, even if the perceived threat could be avoided, or you could, you know, leave the situation without using dramatic force or dramatic, you know, that person suffering, you know, repercussions like death, I can't agree with that. And this is obviously, I don't want to sit here on, you know, drinking my Tetley tea and eating my scones from over here in the UK and telling Georgia State how it needs to govern itself. But there's obviously something wrong because this is a news story. Do you know what I mean? Because if from what you said there, they're enabling it. They're almost saying like, hey, yeah, we give you the right to kill whoever. And what is a perceived threat anyway? And how do you even define that? How do you know, I could be perceived threat, someone looking at me funny, or, you know, they're walking towards me a certain way, or, you know, this is all subjective. You know, perceived threat, that's quite subjective. Like, you know, and then to allow someone to have, you know, respond to a situation like that, even by killing someone, or, you know, in order to defend yourself, it just seems disproportionate and unreasonable. So it's very difficult to wrap my head around because it's just, even if he went into this house and robbed it, and he was a burglar and he did all this stuff, even then, I don't think he should have been subject to something like that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, even if this guy was a criminal and he did commit a crime, I still don't agree with him being hunted down and killed.
So it's a really interesting point about what is a threat, right? Because I think, you know, in a place where the fear of the black man is so prevalent, like it is in the South of America, because it's just entrenched in history there. Just being an athletically built young black man could be a perceived threat. Obviously, like a really sad case, and I hope that justice does prevail in this instance. And yeah, I think the bigger issues is something that is going to continue happening in this country until some of these issues are addressed. So I know we gave our listeners a whole bunch of fight talk in the last week, and we are, you know, essentially going to stay away from it. But there is a story in the news that is really blowing up the fight world, and that is the footage of the one and only Iron Mike Tyson back in training, looking very svelte. So I mean, you know, the rumor is, or the word on the street is, that he is looking to make a comeback, right? Are we to take this seriously? Can we expect to see him make a real run at any sort of heavyweight success, or is this just a flash in the pan publicity stunt?
First of all, I am a massive fan of Mike Tyson. I've watched, you know, all the documentaries about him. I've watched his. Admittedly, I haven't been listening to his podcast, but I will.
That's the rival, bro. That's the rival.
Into that. That's that's it. The Hot Box podcast. In his time, for those of you who don't know, I mean, if you've been living under a rock and you don't know who Mike Tyson is, think of the Coliseum days when, you know, people would be gathering around waiting to see someone get absolutely murked. That is what a Tyson fight was. People would tune in around the world to watch a destruction, basically. And he's, at one point, he was considered the most, you know, dangerous man on the planet, you know, the scariest man on the planet. We've seen Tyson after his boxing career. He's now a completely different man in terms of his attitude, his persona, and I think he would even admit to his, you know, to his fans that, like, that person Tyson he's no longer recognizable to him. In his prime, it was between his age of 20 and in his late 30s, his mid 30s. So to him, he probably doesn't even recognize himself. And to hear that he's, you know, making a comeback, we see fighters do this quite a lot. We see them, they miss the fame and fortune, they miss the attention, the spotlight being on them, or they miss the, you know, the income stream. It doesn't strike me that Tyson is someone who's strapped for cash, because, you know, he's got a lot of fingers and a lot of pies at the moment with the podcast and his old weed, cannabis farms and ranches that he's involved with. So I don't know how much of it is for money, but I mean, for me, I'm happy with the freak show stuff, like people coming back and, you know, fighting other people. I'm happy to get down and dirty with that sort of stuff, like to watch the freak show stuff from time to time. But for me, I watch sport for highly athletic, gifted individuals competing against each other, and they're the best in their domain. That's why I watch it. Something like this, I guess, is fun, but it's also dangerous as well. Like he's, you know, how old is he? Like 50 odd. Like he you know, he looks like in tremendous shape, and he looks like he can obviously still throw a punch. But I don't know how I feel about it. I guess it's a little bit of me is excited, but there's a little voice in my head that's like, is this a good idea? Should you be encouraging this? Should you be?
So I'm on the other end of the spectrum in terms of his rationale for the decision. I actually do think a lot of it is financial. You know, it's been well publicized how much of a fortune that Mike Tyson squandered throughout his career. And I think if he makes even $5 million from a comeback fight, which I think is a conservative estimate, that's still $5 million. I think, he might have a few business ventures going on, and is there ever too much money? And I think it is a solely financially motivated decision. You know, and look, people talk about the age. I mean, we've seen older people come back into the game. George Foreman famously came back well into his 40s and recaptured the heavyweight title 20 years from his last reign, right? And he had a successful comeback and, you know, rode off into the sunset. George Foreman was the pastor of a church in that time. Mike Tyson was not living a clean lifestyle for a lot of that time. He's got years in his body, I think, from the lifestyle he led. So I don't think making that comparison, you know, is completely linear. Of course, Bernard Hopkins boxed into his 50s. And again, he lived like a monk. So I do worry about the safety of Mike Tyson. And I don't want to see him come back. So if I don't have any interest in it. If he's going to come back into the game, have an exhibition against Evander Holyfield, great, cool. You know, two older guys put on there, they'll throw some punches, do 8 rounds, great, fine. Well, you're going to jump back into the heavyweight division and make a run at the title. You're going to fight Tyson Fury. You're going to fight Deontay Wilder. It's not something I want to see. The sport has evolved to a point now that I don't think, you know, a 5'10" heavyweight is there even a path to victory against some of these elite heavyweights? Yeah, no,
I'd agree. I mean, if this is completely painted as a one and done, flash in a pan, you know, fight between another person who's like an Evander Holyfield or another slightly advanced retired fighter, I don't know. And as long as it's all sanctioned by a commission and they pass the required health checks and all that stuff, I guess I don't, on the face of it, have a problem with it. Where I do have a problem with it is when they start saying like, I'm back and I would knock out Tyson Fury and I'll knock out Deontay Wilder. It's like, listen, like maybe in percentage chance of that happening is like 1 in 7 trillion, maybe. But like, that's where I start to lose interest. It's when, I mean, I'll tune in because I'm a fan of Tyson. And am I interested? Not really. Like, I'm not really interested in the outcome. I guess where I have the problem is when they paint it as if they're back in the division and they're in the same sort of discussions as some of these elite heavyweights, like an Anthony Joshua, like a Deontay Wilder, like a Tyson Fury, because I mean that's just simply not the case. Like, then it's not a competition.
That's the promotion game, though, isn't it? So you know, that's to drum up interest in their return. You know, and you've seen this. You know, have you ever seen a 6-punch combination be played as much as this viral video of Tyson hitting pads? People have said to me, Tyson's back, he's looking great. He looked great for 6 seconds. I look great for 6 seconds. I could punch pads for 6. Do you know what I mean? So, like, you know, and listen, I'm sure a lot of his Tyson was never the most cerebral fighter as well. It's not like he's going to come in and he's a slick defensive fighter. Listen, Floyd Mayweather will come back at 55. I say he could still do it. But Tyson's not known for being this like, you know, super slick stick and move type fighter. He's going to get in there and he's going to try and have to get on the inside against these bigger heavyweights. That the social media is booming. People are talking about it, and he has to pose it as though I'm making a run, I'm making a comeback. But the reality is, I think if you know the sport, you know where we're at with this one, right?
Yeah, exactly. But you know, it's the and again, hate to use the word filthy casual fans, but that's the people who are going to be fueling this. It's the same as the McGregor Mayweather fight, isn't it? It's like it's these freak show events, and the promoters do an absolutely. I'm kissing the Italian kiss of the fingers. They do an absolutely fantastic job of making fans believe, like Brendan Schaub, making the fans believe that McGregor has a chance against a Floyd Mayweather, that Tyson has a chance against a Deontay Wilder. They do an absolutely brilliant job of it. But yeah, it's just if you know the sport and you watch the sport and you saw Tyson get knocked out by Danny Williams at the end of his career. Granted, he's not, he wasn't motivated, and he even admitted it himself. I think he even said the comment like, "I wouldn't disgrace the sport of boxing by losing to these type of fighters." I think he actually said something similar to that when he was in the ring, just before he retired from the sport. So someone who made a comment like that and then now is coming back, to face off with someone. It's
at the end of the day, the bag, the money is the most important thing for a lot of people. And I mean, legacy is something that you either care about or you don't. But I just hope that Tyson doesn't put his health at serious risk by getting back in the ring. But yeah, man, we'll see how this plays out. I guess at a time when there's no competitive sports and everyone's just glued to their phones all the time, it's a great time to announce anything. So we'll see how this plays out with Tyson.
All right, Lewis. Well, another one in the bag. This has been slightly more diverse than our previous chat around UFC 249, but all the fun is still the same. It's great being able to sit down and flesh out some of these bit more difficult subjects with a lot of moving parts and complexity. So yeah, I mean, obviously now, the podcast is pretty much everywhere. It's on Twitter, it's on Instagram, it's on YouTube, it's on Spotify, it's on Apple Podcasts. It's we've tried to make it as widely available as possible.
There's no excuse, is there?
Exactly, that's it. So, there's absolutely no excuse for us to not have 1 million views.
Oh, no, if you're my friend on any social media platform and you don't follow or subscribe to the podcast, lose my number. Like, there's nothing else to say about it. I don't respect those people. But yeah, no, honestly, like you said, we're available everywhere now. 4 Yogz, pretty easy to find. So, all those subscribes, all those reviews, all the feedback really helps the show because we're trying to build this into something better. So, yeah, please do get involved in that one. And we are looking at bringing video into the podcast very soon. So, like, keep watching this space. And yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I'm off to go and get my first ever tattoo. I'm actually getting the 4 Yogz logo tattooed on my back because I rep the gang that hard.
On your back? I thought you said it was on your face.
Yeah, my mum was like, "Lewis, what are you fucking doing?"
Well, I hope it goes well, man. Be sure to keep me in the loop of what it looks like. Send me a before and after.
My leg before tattoo and my leg after.
Yeah, please do, because I forgot what your leg looks like by now. So yeah, if you can send me a picture before and after, that'd be great. Like we said, it's been a lot of fun. We're going to try keep on churning out as much content as possible. And until next time, I guess.
Thanks for tuning in. Back with episode 5 next week. Till then, stay safe. From me, Lewis, in California.
And from me, Souphiane, in the UK.
Peace. Until next time. Peace is so played out.
Peace.
Peace with the echo. Peace. Yeah. All right, brother. Take care of yourself, yeah?